Hello, I'm Tony Allen Bernier. I'm going to show you how I make one of my Newsboy caps. This one doesn't have a button on top. I make them in such a way where the seams come together real nice, so you don't necessarily need that. But I will go over the process. There's a few different ways you can do different buttons and things on top. I don't use the standard ones with those spikes that just kind of rip through material and hold them on. I have a few other options I like to use, and I'll go through those and show you what I do there. I'll be sewing on a Cobra Class 26. It's my new machine. Loving it. I will have a table attachment on it for most of the video, and then I'm going to take that off for when I put the sweatband and the brim on here. It makes it a lot easier to get in there. If you're going to be sewing on a flatbed machine, I suggest when you get to this point, go to my flat cap video, because I sew that flat cap completely on my flatbed machine. And that shows you how I manipulate this, twist it, get it under there to get this on there nice. The cylinder arms make it a lot easier, and it helps with purses and a lot of different things like that too. The only thing I can't do is real thin lining. Even that's hard on my other flatbed machine. That's an industrial machine. So if I'm doing like a thin lining, I'll use just a standard home sewing machine, something like that. But if you lighten up the tension quite a bit, you can do upholstery grade fabric no problem through here. I have a cap. This cap was completely done on this machine, the lining and everything. I'd like to thank Maker's Leather Supply for sponsoring this video, especially Aaron Heiser, but it's a family-run business. They're all great people. I had an opportunity to go down there and teach a couple classes from their storefront. It was a great experience. I suggest checking them out online. They have a lot of great products, great leather. Big rolls of the basting tape you'll see me using in this video. I use that to get these seams real nice. It works great. Sometimes I'll even put a little piece, this is more of a stretch fit, but if it's like a custom fit hat, I'll put a little piece underneath in between here, and that helps keep that fold nice until it really sets in from wear. If you're looking for the plastic inserts, the sweatband material, and the patterns themselves, I sell those through my Etsy shop. I'll throw the link below. Don't forget to throw a like on this video and subscribe. So the first thing I do is separate. Some of them have numbers and some of them are just letters. So these four will be sewn separately and then sewn to those four. Alright, so I got the pieces with numbers on them. This one has a number and a letter because that will be sewn to the other side of those four. I'm sewing the side 2 and side 2 together. Line up one end. Line up this end. I usually put the clips so that they're holding right where the seam is going to be. If there's a little bit of slack on some of the pieces, you have to work that in. It's there to help the shape of the hat. I usually go overboard with clips, but hey, it works for me. Whenever I can, I like to start on this side and work my way towards the tips there. If I see a little slack kind of building up, I'll slow down, make sure it gets worked in underneath the pressure foot evenly. And when I get towards the end here, making sure that the two ends are lined up nice, I stop short so that this end doesn't get stitched over. That way when I sew the other piece to this side, I'll be able to fold that back and get the seam right up to meet with that end. Then I'll sew the other two of those, 4 and 4. And you can see on this one, if I line up this edge, there's a difference there. If I line up that edge, discrepancy there. So what I'll do is line it up and think of where the stitching is going to be. And wherever that thread's going to come right there, I'll put a clip right there so the two ends match up right where the seam is going to be. Again, just even it up because this top piece has a little more slack. I do that because when it comes from the seam, when the hat's completed, this piece won't just go to the seam and then sharp corner. It'll come to the seam, and then this piece will kind of have a rounded appearance coming from that seam on the other side. Helps give the hat a more natural look, cleaner shape. And again, if it helps, go crazy with the clips. It's not going to hurt anything. I'd rather take some extra time and sew a nice looking cap than try to rush through it. Getting a little bit of slack build up, so work that in slowly. Make sure it gets under there evenly across the seam. Again, stop short so I have room for the seam on the other side. Make sure those back stitches get right on top of the previous ones. If you come off of there over this way, or even worse this way, you're going to see those. This way it's going to make it hard to fold this over and do that double seam or the French seam. Once you get those sewn together, grab the other two again. We got 3 and 3, so we're going to get them two set up. And because we stopped short here, it makes it a lot easier to line those up, get the other two out of the way. You'll be able to sew that seam right up to meet with that other one. It'll help get a nice clean appearance, so you don't even have to put one of those buttons or anything on top of this cap, because you'll have all them seams coming together real nice. You see, with that corner of that tape, I know exactly where I have to be. If I did the tape straight across, I may have this edge or behind the needle a little bit lined up with the edge of the tape, thinking I'm hitting a 3/8 inch seam allowance. But by putting that corner, I put it directly across from the needle, so I know exactly where I need to line up the material to that corner of the tape. Hits that seam allowance just right. Okay, I'm getting close to the corner. I make sure the two pieces I'm doing are lined up nice and get them other ones out of the way. I don't want to start sewing extra layers together. Work it up slow, right up to the other one. I want to make sure I'm still only going through those two, but I'm meeting right up where that other stitch line came. Back stitch right on top of the seam. I didn't quite hit it. So I might just peel those out again and probably just leave some slack and peel those out and then tie it off, hand stitch one extra stitch and tie it. Before you sew the two panels together with the 4 and 4, I'm going to top stitch all of these. But if you just went over and top stitched them one at a time, you're going to get all kinds of bunching up and thickness there that you don't want. So I start by taking the very middle one, open that seam up, and I can see where them stitches are on the opposite side. I'll trim this so that it'll fold and line up with those. But make sure you're not trimming right up to or on that stitch. So when I fold that over, it's lined up so that when the opposite side folds over, it goes over nice. Way less thickness and bunching up. Do that on both sides of this. the sides. And look at that other opposite seam again. And trim that one. So when you get all of them folded, it lines up way cleaner. See where I missed the top stitch back on this side, so I just peeled the thread and tied it in a little knot, put a little dab of glue right there on that knot. So now when that's folded, and this one, they all come together without creating a huge thickness. They all come together without it being 15 layers. And I leave these end ones long. And then after I do all my top stitching, I'll hit them tips. But get these started, and you never want to like pull apart while you're doing these folds and stuff. Just press. Sometimes I use basting tape, sometimes I don't. I think I'll use it this time. So you don't want to go way up over all this. You're just going to create more thickness. So I'll get it close without going over the opposite side seam. And I don't go right up to the threads either. And when you got a curve to go, you don't want to pull this taut to get that curve. Let the inside of the curve fold, and the tape will lay just flat once you peel this backing off. See how I'm not yanking on it to get it straight? I just let the long side of the curve go straight, and that bunched up area will lay down, and once you peel that off, it'll work just fine. I'd usually wait to peel that other side off until both are taped. I didn't really use this stuff at all. I went to Aaron Heiser's Maker's Leather Supply, taught a couple classes, and he said, hey, check this stuff out. I think it'll help get them seams cleaner, and stuff works great. There. And once you got both sides taped, you don't want to pull it apart at all, but just pressing finger from underneath and above. And I move a little bit each time and then work those wrinkles out. And you can even peel it back up a little, even it out. Then it holds it just perfect while you're doing that top stitch. You won't get any bunching or folds on that. And I'll fold over all these seams. If I don't use basting tape, I'll usually fold them all over. It works better if you're just doing a fabric hat this way. Fold them all over, hold them in place while I hit one of my top stitches, and that first one usually holds everything on this end together and down. And then when I back stitch, you keep it within that seam allowance so that when you sew the two together, you won't have a bunch of back stitching showing on the top. That is, unless you put a button on and stuff, it's not as big a deal. And again, since I got a curve here, instead of trying to pull it, because that's just going to pull the material together, I let that slack be on the inside corner, and then just push it down. Close to the stitching, but not right up on it. Sometimes it'd be a little tricky grabbing a corner of that. And again, don't pull this apart and press the seam down. Just have a finger underneath and press the two together. And after all those layers coming together here, that's still pretty thin, considering. If you're looking for rolls of this tape, Aaron Heiser at Maker's Leather Supply sells big, I think they're 60-yard rolls. And I have little 20-yard rolls that are like an add-on to the plastic bill inserts I sell, or the physical patterns. I'll mail it out with that, because if I was to charge shipping, it would end up being as much as a big roll anyways. You'll see I kind of press it down without just kind of working it the whole length. Press it down in sections, then ease the slack in there. Sticks really good. It can help too to give it a couple taps. Don't hit too hard, you're going to start tearing the leather or the material. Flattens it out nicely. Just trying to think of what to use to line this up. How wide do I want that French seam? I think what I'll do is pick that side of the foot and have it ride right on that seam line. And what I'll do is I'll go on one side, flip it around, and come on the same side as the seam when I sew the other side of the French seam, so I can have the distance perfect. If I sewed through this way and then went through this way again and just moving it over to the other side, it's going to be real hard to have them identically distanced. And I just watch right where I want that foot to hit on that center. A lot of times you'll see a piece of reinforcement in between on the back side so that it's helping the seam hold together. I've never had any issues with caps. When I do upholstery, I definitely have to do that. But with these flat caps, especially with a strong material, you don't need to do that. Since everything's situated the way we want it, everything will come together nicely at the end there. Sometimes it helps to have a little pair of scissors or something holding it where you want it to be. So I don't sew all the way to these extra ends. I stop where the edge is so that I can trim those later without hitting stitches. But when I backstitch, I want to make sure I'm not going past that 3/8 inch seam allowance, because then the double stitches are going to show. Look cleaner if you keep them hidden. Since I use that basting tape, it helps hold everything in line. Especially with thinner materials, you can get this to start to fold and get under there and hit weird. Thicker stuff you don't use basting tape, or I don't use basting tape as much. but if you do, it definitely helps keep everything nice and straight. Again, I'm stopping right at the edge, back stitching so it stops before that seam allowance, that way it'll be hidden. I'll throw a picture up of the lining here, a close-up to show you. See, everything's laying nice, as few layers as possible. Whenever you're maneuvering stuff around, it's good to have the needle down in there so it stays aligned. When I'm doing the top stitch, you'll notice I don't ever pull the material apart. I'm just directing it in there. That way you don't see a bunch of stitches sticking out right in the center there. Another reason I like this machine is it's got the triple feed. You'll see the needle move with the pressure foot, so if you're doing multiple layers or something, it holds everything real nice. I've tried to sew these caps on an old boot patcher machine where it's only got the top feed and just slips across the bottom, doesn't even have the double feed, and that is difficult to keep everything straight. But it can be done. If you're using a real floppy leather, that basting tape helps give it a little more body. This one will be alright. I'm using a thin lining, so it's probably good I did the basting tape on this one. I like my hats to have a little more rigidity to them. Just looks a little bit higher quality than just a real thin material like what you buy at the store. Do this to that other 4 pieces, and then we'll stitch the 4 and 4 together. And you see, once you get that 3/8 inch seam allowance, I might have a little bit of messiness showing, but be surprised how clean it'll look. Oh, one more seam. Okay. I have both sets of 4 done. And what I do is lay it down and kind of fold it back about as far as the seam allowance would be. Line up those seams. And put a clip on there to hold it down good. Then I'll clip the end and fill in the space here with clips. I got these little sewing clips from Amazon. I think it's like $10 for 100 of them or something. So this is just one of the other conchos. You could just do a decorative concho or something. And then this is like a button. Or a snap. I wouldn't put the snap parts on there, but I would use something that had a small hole that would go through, like a small washer, and go through that hole and then just peen that out behind that washer. So I mean, you can do just about anything. If you look for these decorative snaps, if you look for the buttons on jeans and things, you can get a pack of those on Amazon or something. Like I said before, if you're doing a thin lining, do it on a standard sewing machine, but I already went ahead and did this. So what you want to do is find the front. You can look for your letters, the A's in the front, or you can look at how it's shaped. And the other thing is, each side was a side, just that. So if you're looking at that last seam we did, one's the front, one's the back. The front has a harder curve coming up than the back. The back kind of finishes straighter. So this is the front. And then I'll do the same to this. That's the back, this is the front. And I'll place the two front seams together, line them right up, throw a clip on there, and you can work your way around or just bebop back and forth. But I think, don't throw them all on right away. Just do 4 straight across from each other, and then see if you need to pull this out a little. Since the lining is sewn with the exact same pattern, it's on the inside, therefore it doesn't need to be quite as big. You kind of fluff it into the cap. I can already tell that needs to come out a little. You can feel the folds that will be forming in there if you got too much slack somewhere. And just as you make sure it's sitting in there nice, start throwing the rest of your clips on. I'll do all the seams first and then I'll fill in the gaps in between. And instead of leaving the curve, because like I said, it doesn't need to be quite as big, but I'd rather the hat be shaped by the shell versus the lining. So I left the lining the exact same pattern, and as you see, we just bop it out a little bit. But if we have it kind of at a curve, there's some slack on the inside. So I'll leave it straight so it matches up and throw a couple clips on there. And that's just a quick way for that length of material to be evened across there. But I'm going to set this aside for now because I'll need to take this tabletop off. But I want to do the bill first. Now the bill has 2 different size parts. One is a little smaller than the other. I'll line them up straight and throw one clip right in the middle. And again, I always like to put the clips right where the seam is going to be. But on the insert, I go a little shorter on the seam, maybe 2/8 instead of 3/8, which would be just 1/4. So 1/4 inch in. That way, when that seam needs to be folded to one side underneath the bill, you don't have as many wrinkles, because the more that seam allowance comes out, the more wrinkly it's going to be because it's trying to tighten that down. Flip over, since this is the bigger side, it'll have slack. So I'll push it towards that clip a little and add a couple right there to compensate for some of that slack. But that 3 will just kind of help hold it. If I'm pulling this around, it won't slide around. Then you want them on the ends. I usually put a couple on the ends too. We don't need to work the slack all the way up to this end. So I'll just leave that straight. Now all this slack needs to be worked in. Let me turn it so you can see. There's a decent amount of slack on there. That's so this piece will be able to wrap all the way around the front of that plastic brim and have the slack necessary for it to look nice and clean. So at this point, go right in between the two clips and have the same amount of slack on each side. And I'll even try to push a little bit into right where the clip's clipping. The other thing you can do too is that bottom one will stretch, especially leather. I find leather to be a little bit easier than fabric, but my flat cap video is fabric, so I figured I'd do the news one here. Do this one with leather. This is another case where I put a lot of clips on because I'm trying to get that slack to stay nice and even. Yeah, that's a lot of clips, but it works. And you can already see how that slack builds up, so when that plastic is sitting in there, it wants to be in that shape that just wraps around the front of that. Okay, so like I said, I go a little short. I don't do the full 3/8. I just go like a 1/4. So, right at the edge of this is what I'm doing. You can mark it with tape or something. One little trick I do. I always like to fold a little edge so it's easy to get off, but if you take a shirt or something, just so it gets fuzzy and not so sticky, or even your hand, that's going to pop off real easy. I usually would never use anything but garbage scissors to cut tape, but you know. Alright, so that is my new one. Okay, so I don't get my fingers too close, which I already do. Kind of make sure that feeds under there well. So I'll grab scissors to hold that. Alright, see, came off easy, done with that. I sell these inserts in sets of 5. They're just a little bit harder to get to stay in shape. Don't overly fold one spot, but if you work with them, they'll get into the shape eventually. They're a little lighter, and they can go through a standard industrial machine, a flatbed, so that I'll show you later how the cylinder arm really comes in handy for getting the last few steps done. But my flat cap video shows how you can use these floppy ones on a standard flatbed machine. But I like this plastic. It's a special plastic so that it's heat resistant. Like you leave this on the dash in your car, unless you're in Texas and it's like 300 degrees in your car or something. This can handle a lot of heat, and it sews through easy without being brittle. And once you get it into shape, it's a nice fit without being too thick or too heavy. If you're using a real heavy plastic, you definitely need a cylinder arm to go through, because you can't manipulate the heavy plastic like you can this stuff as you're feeding it through that other machine, the standard flatbed. But anyways, looks pretty straight. Sometimes I'll go back and give it a little trim, because you will see this seam allowance, at least the bump it makes. flip that inside out, find the long side. So you can see that side's the longer side. So all that seam allowance is going to fold over to the short side so that the long side wraps around. This takes a little bit of finesse, mess with it for a little bit. What I'll do is I'll get one side, maybe like 3/4 of an inch, and get that to be flush with the front of the plastic underneath there. See, that's the seam allowance fold, that's the plastic. So this is the long side going around. A couple clips to hold that, and then I'll give this a stretch while making sure that all that seam allowance is folded up onto that side. And then you can grab this, put it in between the fold here, and then pull it back and use your thumb to press that plastic down in there. Give it a stretch. The more you can stretch this across here, the straighter, nicer it'll be. You know, don't go overboard, but you definitely want to pull that and get a stretch going. Check to make sure the seam allowance is all on the top here. Flatten it out, even stuff up. Got a lot of folds in there. What you can do is if there's a fold right there, grab it on each side, bend it, and then put your thumb on that fold and go back over. And it kind of presses the rest of that material over so that fold isn't as intense. You can also go in with this, just kind of smooth it out, even it out. But you want the same amount of slack on each side, so we'll try to keep that in mind as we're stretching this. Go back and forth from side to side. Always do a couple of clips so it holds it, because that's some tension. It's getting pretty smooth now. You're going to want to kind of twist it with your fingers here across the front surface so it's flush at the front edge there. Don't put these on past the seam allowance. I put them right on it to hold it flat, and I'll use that as I go across to find these lumps. It's like if I feel one there, just do a little bit of that and then go over the top again, and it spreads it out, and place a clip on there. Don't pull it hard, but get it so it's smoothed out. And you place this right on the edge of the plastic, and I just rock it a little until it pops off the plastic. That way it kind of holds it nice and straight, smooth. This is where I usually use the roller. Pop a couple of those off, and this seam allowance is about right here, so I want to be close but not too close. Maybe about right there. Now you could use a piece of tape or something too, but this roller works real nice because I just keep a certain amount of pressure up against it, and it'll keep me from pressing past it, and it holds that nice curve. And when you do that, you can get some nice clean looking multiple lines. So that first one will be here, the second one will be back a little bit, and for this flat cap, I believe it was inch, maybe inch and a half back from the front edge. And that second one that I'm sewing keeps it on there, it's nice and straight. Then I'll go over it again with a real thin thread. Usually I use my boot patcher machine. The second line that I sew is where I'm going to use that stitch to sew this to the cap itself. And I'll show you that later. And usually I drop down to a 69 thread to do that. But I start, so we got the plastic right here. I'll start right on that corner. So it kind of holds all that down. And then I come at a pretty sharp angle, so it works my way to the allowance I want. So I'm not to the plastic yet. It's just a stitch holding all those layers down right into the corner. So now that I got up to the plastic, continue my stitch. Right before I get to the plastic, I slow down and make sure I'm feeding it under there a little bit, because it'll hit that plastic and keep kicking it back if it doesn't hit it just right. Go slow, let it kick up onto the plastic. I go real slow, make sure I keep that curve just right, especially if you're going to do several layers of stitches across there and you need them to match up. And then once I get off of the plastic, there, it's like 2 stitches off the plastic, get that out of the way, I'm going to stitch towards this corner, turn it, go directly at it. So what that's going to do is hold all that down, compress it a little bit. So I like to trim that seam allowance to this. I might leave a little extra and remember that when I'm sewing, but if you do that, then it's a lot easier when you're putting it in the cap to have those edges just match if this is already cut to a seam allowance. To be a 3/4 inch from this edge maximum. That way you leave enough room, because you want about 1 inch. You could probably go a little more than 1 inch, but I like to go 1 inch from that edge. And this will be the stitch line. I'm just doing it first on here to hold everything in place, and you get a nice clean straight stitch line. And then I'll sew it to the cap using that same line. You could wait until everything's said and done and then sew it to the cap while sewing that secondary stitch line. I'll start just past the plastic so I can hide the back stitch. Alright, you can see where I had the table before. The cylinder arm comes in handy. You could do this on a standard flatbed. You could do the whole process on a standard flatbed. My flat cap video shows that. For this news cap, I'm using my new sewing machine. And you're going to want to sew the lining to the shell, but you want to do it just on the very edge, so that when you come back with that 3/8 inch seam allowance for the sweatband, it'll be hidden. This will just hold everything nice for you. I usually slow down when I'm going over the seams like this, so it has a chance to grab without slipping. I'm also not pulling apart when I go across the seams, because not all stitches go right up to that edge. So I'll just kind of make sure I hold it straight and feed it through there. So if I was pulling, it's going to start separating that. I'm also feeling underneath that if some of the lining starts to fold up and come over, I'm not going over like a bunch of edges and stuff. I'm feeling underneath and making sure it's all smooth and pressed into the cap. In order to find the center of the insert, it doesn't matter how the center is as far as the material goes. We want to find the center of the insert. So I'll use a centering ruler. Use the edge of the table. Fold the material over the edge of the table and do that so that the plastic is right butted up against the edge. Then I'll use a centering rule. Watch the table and get the ruler matching that table. And then I'll move it so that this side and this side match up. Hold that down. Then I modified these clips so that I can get a deeper grab. I use these for here and also to pin it to the top of the hat. So maybe even just pick this up, get that clip dead center straight, like so. So it looks real straight. And since I got that center marked, I'll lay this down facing this way. So that seam allowance that's folded over, you can feel it, that's going to go down so the top will be flat. And you're going to grab the front of the cap, the most pointed section here. I'll line it up with the center here. Clip, I should be pretty dang close. Maybe put a couple on there. Looks pretty straight. Check. See if it visually looks good. And you can also look at the back here. How close is it to that next seam? And then just work this in. Now you don't want to pull and stretch the material real hard to get it to meet the curve of the insert. If anything, I'm going to let the cap itself bunch up. I'm not lining it up with the lining, I'm lining it up with the shell. So to make sure they stay evened up, I'll do that and then switch over here. You want the edges to meet the whole way, like so. That way when we come back and sew the sweatband on with 3/8 inch allowance, it'll line right up with the edge of that plastic coming all the way across. Alright, then I'll check one more time and make sure it's centered. Even lift this up a little bit. Looks pretty dang straight. So I'll pop these off. Leave that center one on to mark right where the center is. You're going to want to lay this down on here. It's a little tricky because of the slack, but that's there to make sure this doesn't get too tight across the bill and it fits right, so you have the excess. Okay, so got that. And I hold it down and take that clip off, then use that same clip again, and that's why I filed those sections out, so I can clip across right there and hold that straight, because while you're sewing this will have a tendency to slip. And I'll throw them other two back on there again. So if that's the plastic, I just put like the end of it up to there, because I'm, I don't know, 2/8 away from that plastic edge. That way the seam that I sew the sweatband on, when it moves, it won't show another seam underneath looking sloppy, but really doesn't matter. But you want to sew this in place first, and I go back all the way and off of it a stitch, and then come back onto it. Hold that down nice. And I'm staying away from the plastic edge a little bit. And this is just to hold it on there. And as you're going, make sure none of this underneath here gets underneath that foot. You can feel underneath from this side. Again, I go just off of it a stitch so that it holds it. It's still, I'm going to check and make sure that that's still held on there, dead center. And then I'm going to go across that stitch line to hold the cap down to the bill and the bill. Now, it's not a bad idea to stop once in a while, check, make sure there's no lining or anything folding it up under there. Smooth. No, you're not pulling it too tight either. You know, make sure that the cap's nice and flush underneath. And as you're coming around this corner, to this side. Make sure it's not bent underneath and stuff weird, because that'll give it too much slack and it might grab too much holding it over. Nothing's going under the presser foot. It's good to stop once in a while and check it again. Hold it. Once you get it nice and flush, grab this and the plastic, and that's going to hold everything straight as you're going. So now it's sewn down. When you wear it, it will help hold the shape of the cap. Alright, for the sweatband, I use an elastic twill. It's real thick, absorbent, and it's got a good elasticity to it. I find the very back of the cap, that back seam, and I'll go past it enough so I have plenty of extra to trim later on, but I'll start sewing a little ways away from it. So I'll get it right at that seam allowance. I used that tape from before, and then this is going to go just enough so that this is going to catch the edge, just the very edge of it. So I'm going to give just the tiniest bit of pull, just barely stretching it. And if you need to make it more of a one size fits all, you can stretch the back out more, and there's a few ways to do that. So now I'm coming up to this plastic insert, and that's going to want to be right on the edge of that. It's got that 3/8 inch. So I'll line it up with the plastic so that I keep this straight, aiming right for it. You're going to give this just a little bit of a pull as you come across and come up on top of the bill, so you don't get any folds right there. A little bit of a pull still. And as I'm coming up to there, I'll turn this by hand. It looks like it's going to hop up there, but if it doesn't, I'm going to need to hit that pressure foot a little. Yeah, it's hopping up there. Sometimes you got to kind of direct it under there a little bit and lift up that pressure foot. You're going to want it right at that edge of the plastic. So now this side of my pressure foot is actually riding on top of the plastic, whereas before it was up against it. See, and then we'll hide that stitch. I'm giving it just the tiniest bit of pull across here. If you pull it too much, the back side of this is going to be real tight, so it's going to stay straight. It's not going to fold up into the hat, and it's going to leave, especially if you wear the hat tight, it can leave a little groove on your forehead after a while. Okay, I'm coming past that seam holding the hat and this together, so I kind of want to make sure this is straight again right here. I'm going to start coming off the cap, so make sure this is lined up. A little bit of a pull. Slow right down and make sure this hops off of there smoothly. The other way I do this too is, instead of trying to watch the exact seam allowance on here, I'll line that right in the center of this. So I'll just put it right in the center, and that's enough to hide that first seam. Okay. Trim that. So I'll give it a pull. Pull my thumb right where that seam is, and then I'm going to kind of want to cut about 3/8 of an inch from that center seam in the back. I'm going to do the same on this way. Give it a pull. Mark that. And I'll just mark this. Then finish the cut. So that so I'm going to go underneath with the seam like this, flip it around. You want to keep that real straight, both sides nice and even. Clips always help. That way you're not fighting it. I usually start like in the middle and back stitch to the edge. And I went just one stitch over the very edge of it, and it'll hold that together. See, watch, one stitch over the edge and back it up, and then go that back stitch all the way to the center again. Maybe tap that with a hammer a couple times. Now at this point you could go try it on, because fold this in, try it on, and if you need to make it tighter, you could come in, bring that seam back some more, and then cut those stitches, and then cut the excess off, and then spread it out evenly as you sew it, stretching it. And then when you let go, it'll do like a bunched up in the back, and that's what I'm going to do actually. Alright, if the size was good, you're set. You can always use one of the smaller patterns. There should be at least 3 sizes on that pattern sheet. But what I'm going to do is that bunched up look like I just talked about. So I'm going to come in probably about this much. Start with a back stitch. Actually, that could be just cut instead of stripping the seam. There's enough to just cut it right behind there. So now when you spread it apart here and finish sewing that, it'll bunch that up just a tiny bit in the back, like a one size fits all kind of. So I didn't end the stitching at the exact same spot, just a hair past that seam. So I'll pull a couple of these out. I'll do from the back so I don't mess up that sweatband. That should be good. Yep. So I'll start back a hair so I can get that back stitch to hold everything. That's where I'm starting. So that's even across there. Could tap that with a hammer. Alright. So what I'm doing now, make sure that's going to line up, yep, is I'm going to be pulling back here too. I'm not going to pull it through, but I'm going to just pull it and let the machine pull it through. I'm going to pull it apart so that it has the tension across there. I'm going to slow down when I get to here because I want to make sure this hops up on there well. Maybe lift up the pressure foot, make sure it gets under there. Should be good. Finish up where I left off on that side. Lock the stitches in. That's it. Now there's a couple things to help kind of get it in the form that you want it to be in, because it's kind of awkward right now. Alright, so didn't really need to bunch up the back at all. I'll give it a little more of a roundness, but it'll fit me just right. So pull so you know how the hat's going to sit, and in the back it's going to be folded right next to the sweatband. So I'm just going to go like up to that second seam right here on each side and just kind of press it in, press the shape in, and you can see that it's already getting that shape to it. But what I like to do is put a hat stretcher in, not to stretch the hat, but just enough to get the form going, and maybe tap the back to get that fold. Tap the back with a little mallet or something. But even beyond that, I'll flip this up and put a piece of this basting tape in here. Now this is usually what I do for like fitted caps, where I'm just making a size. I'm not adjusting it to be like one size fits all. I've never actually put it in one that I wanted a lot of stretch out of there, but we'll see. I'll try it on and see how it works. Maybe even stretch it out. Yeah, that'll probably work good. We'll see how that works. Stretch out the back and let the tape bunch up a little too. That'll work. And then, but like I said, if you're doing a fitted hat, this works really well. And I actually did it to this one. You can see I put one of my little patches on the back too. I did it just in the back section right here on this one, just to really help hold that seam, and I tapped it a little bit with a mallet, and that shape of that cap holds really well without doing that seam that holds the fold, because then you got to grab this and it changes the whole look of the cap. I find this looks a little better, but that's just an opinion. What I like to do is use a hat stretcher. I'm not stretching the hat out. I make them to fit specific sizes. And you could even do this and hit it with a steamer or something too, especially if it's a material. You probably don't want to steam leather much. Get it situated and start expanding it. Centered on the bill and the back. You can see that's going to hold it nice. Leave that sit overnight, and I'll tap the back of this a little. Reinforce where I want that fold to be, and that tape that's in there is going to hold it too. All right, not too shabby.